Planning and Reg were dealing with seat netting and then begging, and this does seem to be taking a very long time. So just so that people know, so I know there's always a lot made of who's here and who isn't here. Legitimate business for those who are at Planning and Reg. So warm welcome to the sparse few, and special welcome to Brenda Steele from Rodney. Bless your heart, Brenda, we love you. And Peter Haynes, who's here from Eden Albert. So apologies are kind of interesting because we... That's right. Yeah, so apologies from Councillor Cooper and Brewer and Fletcher, and then kind of the rest for lateness, really. Sure. Cool. I'll move that. If someone would like to second that.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Member Taipari. I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Any declarations of interest? Anything happens during the meeting, let us know. Minutes. I'll move the 27th of April. Someone would like to second that. Thank you, Councillor Webster. I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Aye. Carried. None of the others. 4, 5, 6, 7. So we'll start.
None of the above.
All right.
So thank you. Thanks so much, John. And just at the end, sorry, just before I forget, Penny and Catherine just want to have a bit of a little process discussion at the end. So over to you.
Okay, so we're talking about 5 different topics today. We're going to start with significant ecological areas, then we're moving on to landscapes, then we'll talk about the volcanic view shafts, then we'll move on to Māori cultural heritage sites, and lastly Māori land and treaty settlement lands. So those are the 5 topics, and as with the last presentations, I've got the lead planners here for all topics, and on some occasions are technical experts in things like ecology, with one exception, and that's the landscape presentation. Unfortunately, the lead planner and our landscape architect aren't available today, but we'll just see how we go with that one. Hopefully we'll be able to answer all your questions. So we'll kick off with SEAs, significant ecological areas, and a little bit of context. You might need to flick that on for me, Catherine. It's not. Right, so as you may be aware, Part 2 and Section 6 of the RMA makes reference to areas of indigenous vegetation, significant habitats of indigenous fauna. So that's the link back to the RMA, and it does reference them as being things that the council has to recognise and provide for their protection as a matter of national importance. So it's not something that's optional, really. We have to do some work in this area, and we do that through our significant ecological areas, SEAs, on land, and they're also in the coastal marine area. So that image up there just shows you how the notations are on the plan. You've got a land SEA in here, I think. Hang on. Can't see that clearly on that slide. It's a bit bright over here. Look at my image here. Oh, so we've got the landward around the coast here in the green, and then we've got the actual marine SEA in here. So that's how we map them. In terms of the text in the plan, the regional policy statement. Oh, this wasn't meant to happen. Here we go. So regional policy statement provides for the identification of SEAs, and the criteria for what constitutes an SEA sits up in the regional policy statement. So that's the guidance in terms of what the threshold is for something becoming significant from the council's point of view, sitting up there in the regional policy statement. There's some provision in the regional policy for reasonable use, cultural practice, harvest by mana whenua, and maintenance of SEAs for open space, tracks, and dwellings within SEAs. So the regional policy statement up at that big strategic level does recognise that in some cases there should be an allowance for SEAs to be modified, some of the vegetation to be removed, but it does require that adverse effects must be avoided as far as practicable, and then you move into minimise effects, remedy, mitigate, and lastly offsetting, which is essentially compensating for the loss of the SEA in another part of Auckland, ideally, to offset that loss. So, and there's some guidance on biodiversity offsetting Then we get down into the rules. So they are Auckland-wide, city-wide rules. They're not sitting in a zone. They actually apply in all parts of Auckland, land and in the CMA, coastal marine area. And it's essentially a discretionary activity to remove vegetation within an SEA. And the exceptions are those things like maintenance around an existing dwelling. So maybe if I just run through them slowly. Existing farming and forestry is a permitted activity. Operation, maintenance, repair and minor upgrading of existing infrastructure is permitted. Vegetation alteration and removal for routine maintenance within 3 metres of an existing dwelling or a building greater than 100 square metres. And the reason for that 100 square metre threshold was to avoid little small sheds sitting in an SEA allowing a lot of ad hoc clearance. So it had to be a reasonable sized building before, as of right, you could go in and start clearing the vegetation. So this is all that balancing of protecting the vegetation with enabling a reasonable use where you've got existing dwellings or other uses happening within an SEA. We've got tree trimming right up to 10 metres was permitted in the plan as notified. So as with all these presentations, this is the starting point when we put the plan out for submissions. Then vegetation alteration and removal up to 300 square metres for a building platform was a controlled activity. So there was an acceptance that if you could have a single dwelling within an SEA on a property and within a quarry zone, vegetation removal wasn't full discretionary, it was restricted discretionary, recognising the importance of quarries to Auckland's growth and development. So that was the notified plan. Moving on to the maps, or the GIS viewer, one and the same basically. They were largely rolled over from the operative regional policy statement from the former regional council and from the operative district plan. So a lot of the former councils had already mapped and protected these areas and done quite a bit of work on them. There were also areas subject to QE2 covenants, Department of Conservation and Ngā Whenua Rahui covenants. So they were also, in many cases, identified as SEAs in the unitary plan. And then we did introduce some new SEAs through the work that the biodiversity team did, some good, really good field survey work in developing the plan, using those criteria in the RPS, Regional Policy Statement. So that's kind of the starting point. The submitters, approximately 700 submission points relating to the SEA rules. As you'd expect, some wanted greater protection for SEAs and some wanted more restrictive controls on development and existing use. And there's an example there of what was meant or where they wanted that to occur. Developers, utility providers and other individuals, organisations sought the opposite. They wanted removal or reduction of some of the controls, a more permissive approach to development and existing use. For example, providing for removal of non-Indigenous vegetation, because in the rules in the proposed plan, all vegetation was protected. It didn't distinguish between native and non-Indigenous vegetation as a permitted activity. So that's a bit of a flavour of where the submitters were coming from with some examples. In terms of the maps, again, we've got approximately 700 submission points on the land-based and 140 submission points on the marine SEAs. And these are the sorts of things that they were questioning. So we've got some site-specific submission points. There were some challenges to the accuracy of the mapping of the SEA overlay. Some requested retention of specific SEAs, some wanted changes or deletion, and others expressed concern of the level of landowner consultation. So that was the submitters' views on the maps. So what was the position Council took into the hearings? Mostly retained the provisions, but we did have some amendments that were agreed to through the committee approval process, and that's those on the screen there. So providing for pruning anywhere within an SEA became a permitted activity. So previously, as I mentioned, within 3 metres of a dwelling or a building greater than 100 square metres was allowed, and there was some pruning up to 10 metres also allowed. That's been extended to pruning anywhere within an SEA. There are controls around how much of a tree or any vegetation you can prune in any one period of time. But the 10 metre limitation was agreed as being overly restrictive. Next point there, increase the amount of vegetation removal alteration permitted for infrastructure basically. So there was an increase in the allowance there. and permitting the minor upgrading of roads within SEAs, restricted to 20 square metres in the Waitakere Ranges, and lastly, providing for the establishment of building platforms for marae or papakainga housing as a controlled activity on Maori land. So that was the changes to the rules. In terms of the maps, there was a huge amount of work undertaken with submitters. So you can see there, 139 amendments were proposed by the council, and that resulted in the full settlement of or full agreement with submitters in 139 cases. So that is pretty extensive work there. An additional 95 amendments to the mapping of SEAs were agreed, which resulted in partial agreement with submitters. And there were 39 agreements made to the marine SEAs, including a small number of additions to the marine SEAs. So there was quite a bit of mediation and one-on-one discussions with submitters prior to the hearings commencing on the maps. And that's it for an overview of the present, what was in the notified plan, the submissions and the council's position on significant ecological areas, and we've got that link to the panel website where you can find all of the evidence from all submitters and the council on this topic, which was topic 023. So just open the floor to any questions, I guess.
Great, thank you. Huge amount of work on this one. Councillor Darby.
Yeah, and likewise I acknowledge that work too. Pretty impressive to mediate to that position. So can you just give us an idea of the status? At the moment the SEAs are recognised, so that's part of the operative, they're operative provisions as of now. So when the panel makes its decision, what is the status of the notified at that point? I just want to get my head around this part of the plan which is operative and then potentially changes, but which is subject to appeal. So what stays current? Is it the...
So the provisions aren't operative, they are effective. There's a difference there. Operative means they're beyond challenge, beyond appeal. It's the very end of the process. They are done and dusted. So nothing in the unitary plan is operative yet. But they did have immediate legal effect. So they started requiring resource consents from 30th of September 2013 when the plan went out for submission. So when the panel comes back with its recommendations, those recommendations have no legal standing, no legal weight at that point in time. That's 22 July. But when the council releases the decision, 19 August, then that decision carries a significant amount of weight, but you still have to wait for the 20 working day appeal period. So the council decision essentially would carry more weight than the, I'll probably ask our legal team to jump in, the notified provisions at that point in time, because things have moved on, but it's still potentially subject to appeal. It's not until the appeal period closes that they have full weight and the operative district plans are replaced at that point in time.
Okay, understood. And the SEAs, are they broken down in, because I remember seeing on the maps there's terrestrial, there's coastal, are they still broken down to subcategories, or was that just highlighted on the maps for convenience? Is there just an SEA category, or are there subcategories?
There's no subcategories for the land-based SEAs, so they are a significant ecological area, or they're not. In the marine environment, there are two categories of SEA. So there is a SEA Marine 1, which has a slightly more restrictive suite of rules than the SEA Marine 2, which is a slightly more enabling set of controls. And in that first slide that John showed us, you could see there was two different colours of shading between the two different marine layers.
Okay, good. That's good. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cashman.
And Madam Chair, John, has there been any change to the definition of what is a land-based SEA?
It's probably one for Marilyn as well.
I feel free to jump in, Jenny, if I get this wrong, but not through the 023 hearings. So the criteria for how the SEA are assessed was part of the RPS hearing for topic 010, and I believe that they were slightly refined but not substantively changed. Jenny's nodding, so I don't think I have much more to add on that.
Okay.